How does a 21-year-old sultan accomplish what dozens of armies failed to achieve for over 1,000 years? How do you conquer walls so massive they were called the greatest fortification in human history, defended by warriors who believed God himself protected their city? On May 29, 1453, Constantinople fell after 54 days of relentless bombardment, and with it died the Roman Empire. Yes, the actual Roman Empire, which had somehow survived in the East while its western half crumbled a millennium earlier. This wasn't just another medieval siege. This was the moment when 80,000 Ottoman warriors, armed with the largest cannons ever built, faced 7,000 desperate defenders protecting the last remnants of classical civilization. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Libraries containing the only copies of ancient Greek and Roman texts, churches holding 1,000 years of Christian relics, and strategic control of the trade routes connecting Europe and Asia. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. The Ottomans didn't just use brute force. They employed revolutionary weapons technology, psychological warfare that would make modern propagandists jealous, and one tactical innovation so audacious that military historians still debate whether it actually happened or became legend. What you're about to discover is how one young sultan's obsession with conquering an unconquerable city changed the course of world history and ushered humanity from the medieval age into the Renaissance. To understand why Constantinople's fall mattered so profoundly, you need to picture the city itself. Built on a triangular peninsula jutting into the Bosporus Strait, Constantinople occupied perhaps the most strategic location in the known world. The only waterway connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, the crossroads where Europe met Asia. The city's landward side featured the Theodosian Walls, a triple-layer defense system built in the 5th century that had turned back every invader for over 1,000 years. We're talking about walls 40 feet high, backed by a second wall 60 feet high, fronted by a 60-foot wide moat that could be flooded from hidden aqueducts. 27 massive towers punctuated these walls every 175 feet, each capable of raining arrows and Greek fire on attackers. The city's seawalls were considered even more impregnable. 240 feet of stone barriers rising directly from the water, making amphibious assault virtually impossible. By 1453, Constantinople had withstood 23 sieges, including multiple attempts by earlier Ottoman sultans. The city had survived the Fourth Crusade, though the Crusaders shamefully sacked it in 1204. Arab sieges in 674 to 678 and 717 to 718, and countless other attacks. Its defenders had access to Greek fire, a napalm-like incendiary weapon whose formula was so closely guarded that we still don't know exactly how it was made. The mere sight of these walls had caused armies of 100,000 men to turn back without even attempting an assault. But by the mid-15th century, the Byzantine Empire that ruled Constantinople had been reduced to little more than the city itself and a few surrounding territories. Once controlling the entire eastern Mediterranean, the empire now consisted of perhaps 50,000 people huddled behind those legendary walls. Internal politics had fractured the empire for decades. Constant civil wars between rival claimants to the throne had bled away resources and manpower. The Byzantines had made a fatal series of mistakes in the preceding centuries, including alienating the Catholic West through religious disputes over minor theological differences. When Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos sent desperate pleas for help to Western Europe in 1452 and early 1453, most ignored him. Venice sent a mere 800 men. Genoa sent nothing officially, though a few hundred Genoese mercenaries came on their own initiative. The Byzantines could field only about 5,000 Greek defenders, plus roughly 2,000 foreign fighters. 7,000 men total to defend 14 miles of walls. They had no navy to speak of. Their treasury was nearly empty, and food supplies would last perhaps 2 months under siege conditions. The empire that had once fielded armies of 120,000 soldiers was now reduced to a skeleton garrison defending one city, relying entirely on their ancestors' stone walls to save them. Facing Constantinople was Sultan Mehmed II, who had become sultan at age 19 in 1451 and immediately became obsessed with conquering the Byzantine capital. Mehmed was no ordinary ruler. He spoke 6 languages, studied mathematics and philosophy, and combined intellectual brilliance with ruthless ambition. The Ottomans, he commanded, were at the peak of their military power. The empire had spent the previous century perfecting a military system that combined the mobility of Turkish cavalry with disciplined infantry and, most importantly, early adoption of gunpowder technology. The core of Mehmed's army was the Janissaries, elite infantry troops taken as children from Christian families, converted to Islam, and trained as fanatically loyal soldiers. These weren't feudal levies or mercenaries who might desert. They were professional warriors whose entire identity centered on the Ottoman state. Mehmed assembled a force estimated between 80,000 and 100,000 men, though the exact number remains debated by historians. This included 1,000 Janissaries, 15,000 regular cavalry, thousands of irregular troops called bashi bazouks, and tens of thousands of laborers to build siege works. But Mehmed's trump card wasn't manpower. It was artillery. In early 1452, a Hungarian engineer named Urban approached the Byzantine emperor, offering to cast powerful cannon for the city's defense. Constantine XI, broke and desperate, couldn't afford Urban's price. Urban then approached Mehmed, who immediately saw the potential and paid whatever the engineer asked. Urban promised to build a cannon that could blow down the walls of Babylon itself. What he delivered exceeded even those boasts. The monster gun he cast measured 27 feet long, weighed over 19 tons, and could fire stone balls weighing 100 pounds. It took 60 oxen and 200 men to transport and required 2 hours to cool down after each shot. Mehmed commissioned dozens of other cannons of various sizes, assembling the largest artillery train the world had ever seen. When test fired at Edirne, the Ottoman capital, Urban's super cannon could be heard from 10 miles away, and its projectile smashed through 6 feet of earth and stone. This was revolutionary technology. Previous cannons were small and relatively ineffective against major fortifications. These monsters could crack the legendary Theodosian Walls like eggshells. Or at least, that was the theory. No one had actually tried bombarding these particular walls with artillery of this scale before. The Ottoman buildup couldn't be hidden, and Constantine XI knew what was coming. In November 1452, Mehmed completed construction of Rumeli Hisara, a fortress on the European shore of the Bosporus positioned to control all ship traffic. This fortress, built in just 4.5 months, sent an unmistakable message. Mehmed was cutting Constantinople off from reinforcement by sea. When a Venetian ship tried to run past the fortress that November, Ottoman cannons sank it, and Mehmed had the crew executed, impaling the ship's captain as a warning. The Byzantines used the winter months to stockpile food, repair walls, and train every able-bodied man in basic combat. They melted down church bells to cast small cannon and collected every scrap of metal for weapons. The emperor ordered the massive chain stretched across the Golden Horn, the harbor north of the city, strengthened. This chain, each link as thick as a man's arm, was supported by wooden floats and could prevent enemy ships from entering the protected harbor. Constantine XI also sent increasingly desperate letters to the Pope and Western monarchs, promising to finally reunite the Eastern and Roman Catholic churches if they would send armies. A few ships trickled in. The Genoese captain Giovanni Giustiniani arrived in late January 1453 with 700 experienced soldiers and immediately took command of the land wall defenses. His presence boosted morale enormously. Giustiniani was a legendary military engineer who had defended multiple cities against Ottoman attacks. On April 2, 1453, scouts reported the first Ottoman units approaching the city. By April 5th, Mehmed's entire army had deployed outside the walls. The Sultan established his red and gold command tent directly opposite the Romanos Gate, the weakest point in the land walls where the ground sloped upward toward the fortifications. Constantine XI made a fateful decision. Spread his 7,000 men along the entire 14 miles of walls rather than concentrating forces. Mathematically, this meant roughly one defender every 10 feet, fine for spotting attackers and initial resistance, but with no reserves for a sustained assault. The Byzantines positioned their few cannon at key points, but they had perhaps a dozen guns compared to Mehmed's 70-plus artillery pieces. The emperor himself took command at the Romanos Gate alongside Giustiniani, placing his best troops at the most vulnerable point. The sea walls, considered nearly impregnable, received lighter defense. The Golden Horn chain was secured, with a small fleet of Byzantine and allied ships stationed behind it. On April 6th, Mehmed sent one final surrender demand, as Islamic law required before attacking a city. The terms were simple. Surrender peacefully, and the population would be spared. Resist, and every man, woman, and child would be enslaved or killed according to the laws of war. Constantine XI refused, reportedly saying he would never surrender the city. And so the siege began. The Ottoman bombardment commenced on April 12th, and nothing in military history had sounded like it before. Urban's great cannon fired 7 times that first day, each shot accompanied by a thunderclap that could be heard across the Bosporus. One of those 200-pound stone balls struck the outer wall near the Romanos Gate and shattered a section 15 feet wide. The Byzantines watched in horror as fortifications that had stood for 1,000 years crumbled under this new technology. But here's what the Ottomans didn't anticipate. The defenders adapted immediately. Each night, Byzantine work crews ventured out under cover of darkness and repaired the damaged walls using rubble, timber, and barrels filled with earth. They couldn't restore the original stone construction, but they could create patchwork barriers sufficient to slow infantry assaults. The defenders also dug trenches behind damaged sections, so even if attackers breached the outer wall, they'd face another barrier. This became the rhythm of the siege. Ottoman guns would pound the walls all day, reducing sections to rubble. Then Byzantine crews would rebuild during the night. Mehmed tried concentrating all his artillery on single sections to create a breakthrough. But the repair crews somehow kept pace. The Sultan varied his tactics. On April 18th, he ordered the first major infantry assault before dawn, sending waves of Bashi bazooks, irregular troops considered expendable, against damaged sections of the wall. These initial waves were meant to exhaust the defenders and probe for weak points. The Byzantine response was devastating. Greek fire rained down from the walls, sticky, burning liquid that ignited on contact and couldn't be extinguished with water. Arrows and crossbow bolts darkened the sky. Small cannon loaded with metal scraps fired at point-blank range into the packed Ottoman ranks. The assault lasted 4 hours and achieved nothing except piling Ottoman corpses in front of the walls. Casualties were estimated at 200 Ottomans dead versus perhaps 20 defenders. Mehmed had expected the walls to be a challenge. What he hadn't expected was the fanatical determination of so few defenders holding such an extensive perimeter. But the Sultan had time and numbers on his side. His strategy was simple: keep up relentless pressure, prevent the defenders from ever resting, and wait for exhaustion and mistakes to create opportunities. Then came the naval aspect of the siege, which proved more complex than Mehmed anticipated. The Ottoman fleet of 126 ships had sailed into the Bosporus and attempted to force the Golden Horn chain on April 9th, but failed completely. The chain held firm, and the handful of Byzantine, Venetian, and Genoese ships defending it poured Greek fire onto the Ottoman vessels, sinking several and forcing the rest to retreat. On April 20th, 3 Genoese ships sent by the Pope and 1 large Byzantine transport loaded with grain attempted to reach the city. Mehmed personally rowed to the shore and ordered his entire fleet to intercept them. 126 Ottoman ships against 4 Christian vessels. What followed was an astonishing naval battle witnessed by both armies. The 4 Christian ships, with favorable winds, carved through the Ottoman fleet. The larger European ships towered over the smaller Ottoman galleys, and their crews dropped stones and fired arrows from their higher decks. Ottoman sailors tried boarding, but the Christians repelled them repeatedly. After hours of fighting visible from Constantinople's walls, the wind shifted and pushed the Christian ships safely behind the Golden Horn chain. Mehmed was so enraged that he rode his horse into the sea and nearly struck his admiral with a mace. This naval defeat humiliated the Ottomans and gave the defenders hope that perhaps Western relief forces might break through after all. But Mehmed's next move demonstrated the innovative thinking that made him legendary. If he couldn't force the Golden Horn with ships, he would go around it. On the night of April 22nd, Ottoman engineers enacted one of the most audacious logistical operations in medieval warfare. They built a greased wooden roadway over the hills behind the Genoese colony of Pera, then hauled 70 ships overland, and relaunched them inside the Golden Horn, bypassing the chain completely. Imagine the defenders' shock at dawn on April 23rd when they looked at the supposedly secure harbor and saw dozens of Ottoman ships already inside. This wasn't supposed to be possible. The ships had been dragged over a mile of rough terrain using teams of oxen and hundreds of workers pulling on ropes. This maneuver immediately doubled the length of walls the Byzantines had to defend, stretching their already thin forces even thinner. Constantine XI had to pull troops from the land walls to defend the sea walls along the Golden Horn, weakening the most critical defenses. The Byzantines attempted a night raid to burn the Ottoman ships in the harbor, but someone betrayed the plan to Mehmed, and his troops ambushed the raiders, killing 40 and capturing several, whom Mehmed had impaled within sight of the city walls as psychological warfare. Throughout late April and early May, the bombardment continued relentlessly. Urban's great cannon finally exploded on May 11th, killing the engineer himself and destroying the weapon. But Mehmed had dozens of other guns that kept firing. The Byzantines were exhausted. 7,000 men defending 14 miles of walls meant no one got adequate rest. They rotated in shifts, but even off-duty defenders spent their time repairing damage or moving supplies. Food was running low despite careful rationing. More critically, gunpowder and ammunition for their few cannon were nearly depleted. Morale remained surprisingly high thanks to Constantine XI's personal leadership. The emperor fought alongside his men, encouraged them constantly, and shared every hardship. But everyone knew time was running out. When would Western reinforcements arrive? Rumors spread through the city that a Venetian fleet of 20 warships was en route from Crete. Constantine XI sent a fast ship on May 3rd to scout for this relief force. It returned on May 23rd with devastating news. There was no fleet. No one was coming to save Constantinople. Mehmed, meanwhile, had his own frustrations. It was now mid-May, and he had made no significant progress. His treasury was draining to feed an army of 80,000 plus. Some of his advisors suggested abandoning the siege before the summer campaign season ended. The Sultan's prestige was on the line. He had boasted of conquering Constantinople, and failure would embolden his enemies. But Mehmed was nothing if not determined. He ordered a final, all-out assault to be prepared, planning to throw every available soldier at the walls simultaneously at multiple points. No more testing and probing. This would be a battle of annihilation. He told his commanders the assault would begin before dawn on May 29th and would continue until they broke through or his entire army was dead. The night before this final attack, Mehmed rode among his troops, promising 3 days of unrestricted plundering if they took the city. Islamic law allowed armies that stormed a city after the defenders refused surrender to enslave the population and loot everything. The promise of unimaginable wealth motivated every Ottoman soldier. Mehmed also made a religious appeal, framing the battle as a holy war to capture a city promised to Islam by the Prophet himself. According to a hadith that mentioned Constantinople's eventual conquest. Inside the city, Constantine XI knew the end was approaching. On the evening of May 28th, he gathered his commanders and delivered a final speech. According to the few survivors who later recorded it, he spoke of the city's 1,000-year history, of the obligation to preserve Christian civilization, and of the glory of dying in defense of one's home. Then he dismissed the commanders and made a final tour of the walls, speaking to small groups of soldiers, shaking hands, offering personal thanks. He attended a final religious service in the Hagia Sophia Cathedral that night, a building that represented 900 years of Byzantine Christianity and housed relics and religious art beyond price. The emperor reportedly confessed his sins to a priest and prepared for death. Most of the civilian population crowded into churches, praying for a miracle. Some believed that an angel would descend at the final moment to save the city, as prophecies had long claimed. Others packed valuables and prepared to flee if the walls fell. That night, the entire Ottoman camp lit bonfires and made noise until past midnight. Drums, horns, shouting. A psychological attack designed to prevent the defenders from sleeping. Then, around 1:30 a.m. on May 29, 1453, an eerie silence fell. Both sides waited in the darkness for the final battle. The assault began just after dawn, broke around 3 a.m., with a barrage from every Ottoman cannon firing simultaneously. The noise was described as being like the earth itself splitting open. Then came the first wave, the Bashi bazooks, expendable irregulars meant to exhaust the defenders' ammunition and identify weak points. They attacked at multiple locations along the land walls, but focused on the damaged sections near the Romanos Gate. For 2 hours, waves of these irregulars threw themselves at the walls, scrambling over rubble with ladders, only to be cut down by the desperate defenders. Greek fire turned sections of the battlefield into infernos. Arrows and crossbow bolts fell like rain. The Byzantines held, throwing back ladder after ladder, but they were burning through their supplies at an unsustainable rate. Around 5 a.m., Mehmed signaled for the second wave. The Anatolian regulars, professional soldiers equipped with better armor and discipline. These troops intensified the pressure, attacking in organized formations with proper scaling equipment. The defenders were now exhausted from fighting for 2 hours straight, and the Anatolians came close to establishing footholds on the walls in several places. Giovanni Giustiniani was everywhere along the land walls, directing defense, encouraging men, personally engaging in hand-to-hand combat when Ottomans reached the ramparts. His presence inspired the defenders to superhuman efforts, and they threw back the second wave as well. But around 7 a.m., disaster struck the defenders. A small gate in the wall, the Kirkoporta, a sally port used by defenders to launch counterattacks, had been left unlocked or perhaps had its lock broken by earlier bombardment. A group of Ottoman soldiers discovered it was open, and approximately 50 Turks slipped through into the space between the inner and outer walls. They raised Ottoman banners on the wall towers, creating panic and confusion among the nearby defenders who thought a major breach had occurred. At almost the exact same moment, Giustiniani was struck by a crossbow bolt or small cannon shot that pierced his breastplate. The wound wasn't immediately fatal, but it was serious, and Giustiniani demanded to be taken away from the wall for medical treatment. His evacuation through the defenders' lines caused panic. Soldiers saw their commander being carried away bleeding and assumed the defense was collapsing. Some began to retreat from the walls. Constantine XI rushed to Giustiniani, reportedly begging him to stay, saying his departure would doom the city. But the Genoese captain was in too much pain and was carried to a ship to escape. He would die of his wounds days later in Chios. With confusion spreading through the defense, Mehmed sent in his elite third wave, the Janissaries, led by the giant warrior Hassan Ulubatu. These were the best soldiers in the world at that moment, fanatically brave, superbly trained, and equipped with the finest weapons. The Janissaries concentrated their assault on the damaged sections of the wall near the Romanos Gate, where the defenders were now disorganized and leaderless. Hassan was reportedly first over the walls, planting an Ottoman banner on the ramparts before being cut down by Byzantine defenders. But 18 more Janissaries followed him up, then 50, then hundreds. Once the Janissaries established a foothold, they couldn't be dislodged. They fought with almost superhuman determination, their discipline holding firm even as defenders threw Greek fire and dropped stones on them. Meanwhile, the group of 50 Ottomans who had entered through the Kerkoporta had grown to hundreds, and they began attacking the defenders from behind. Constantine XI realized the walls were lost and that this was the end. According to surviving accounts, he threw off his imperial regalia so he would die as a common soldier rather than be captured and paraded through the Ottoman camp. His final words were reportedly, "The city is fallen, and I am still alive." He then rushed into the thickest fighting at the Romanos Gate and was never seen again. His body was never definitively identified. Some claimed a headless corpse in purple boots, imperial footwear, was found and buried by the Ottomans, but no one knows for certain. Once the Janissaries breached the land walls, the defense collapsed completely. Ottoman troops poured through multiple breaks in the fortifications, and by 8 a.m., Ottoman banners flew from the walls throughout the city. What followed was the brutal sack that Islamic law permitted after a city refused surrender terms. Ottoman soldiers had been promised 3 days of plundering, and they carried out that promise with terrible efficiency. Thousands of Byzantine civilians were killed in the initial rampage. Exact numbers are impossible to determine, but contemporary sources estimate between 4,000 and 30,000 dead, with the truth probably around 10,000. Far more were enslaved. Ottoman soldiers chained together in anyone they caught and marched them back to the army camps to be sold later. Churches and monasteries were ransacked for their gold and silver. The Hagia Sophia alone contained treasures worth millions in today's currency. The famous Library of Constantinople, containing the only copies of many ancient Greek and Roman texts, was partially burned, though some books were saved by Ottoman scholars who recognized their value. Religious icons and frescoes were destroyed or defaced. After 3 days, Mehmed ordered the pillaging stopped and entered the city himself. He rode to the Hagia Sophia and immediately claimed it as a mosque, ordering the call to prayer to be sung from its dome. He walked through the empty streets of what had been one of the greatest cities in the world and was struck by the destruction his army had caused, reportedly quoting a Persian poem about the impermanence of glory. The siege had lasted 54 days and cost both sides dearly. Ottoman casualties are estimated at 10,000 to 15,000 dead or seriously wounded. Though Mehmed's army was so large, these losses barely dented its strength. The defenders lost perhaps 4,000 of their 7,000 soldiers, plus the thousands of civilians killed in the sack. But the losses in cultural heritage were incalculable. The Byzantine Empire, the last continuous link to ancient Rome, the guardian of classical knowledge, the shield that had protected Europe from Eastern invaders for 1,000 years, was completely and utterly destroyed. Constantine XI died without heir, and the Palaiologos dynasty ended with him. Approximately 50,000 of Constantinople's population were enslaved and scattered across the Ottoman Empire. The city's Greek and Christian character was deliberately erased as Mehmed imported Muslim settlers from Anatolia and converted churches to mosques. Within a generation, Constantinople, renamed Istanbul, though that wouldn't become official for centuries, had become a Muslim Turkish city, its Byzantine past surviving only in architecture and ruins. But the fall of Constantinople didn't end Byzantine-Ottoman conflict. It intensified it. Refugees from the fallen city carried terror stories throughout Europe, sparking renewed calls for crusades. Several Byzantine successor states continued fighting. The Empire of Trebizond on the Black Sea coast held out until 1461, when Mehmed finally conquered it. The Despotate of the Morea in southern Greece resisted until 1460. These final Byzantine remnants kept alive hopes of restoration, but they were delaying the inevitable. Mehmed spent the next 28 years of his reign expanding the Ottoman Empire in all directions, conquering Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, and much of Greece. He twice besieged Belgrade, failing both times, and even landed forces in southern Italy, though he died in 1481 before the Italian campaign could develop. The strategic implications of controlling Constantinople proved as important as predicted. The Ottomans now controlled the Bosporus, and thus all trade between the Black Sea and Mediterranean. They could tax European merchants who wanted access to Eastern goods, and they could threaten Europe itself from a base that was geographically positioned to strike the Balkans, Hungary, or Italy with equal ease. Over the next century, the Ottoman Empire would become one of the most powerful states in the world, and its 1453 conquest of Constantinople was the foundation of that power. Yet Constantinople's fall also had an unexpected consequence that changed world history. It helped trigger the Renaissance. Byzantine scholars fleeing the Ottoman conquest carried Greek manuscripts to Italy and other Western European cities. These texts, works by Plato, Aristotle, ancient mathematicians, scientists, and historians, had been preserved in Byzantine libraries, while Western Europe had lost most classical knowledge during the Dark Ages. The influx of these texts and the Greek-speaking scholars who could teach them sparked an intellectual revolution in the West. Universities in Florence, Venice, and later throughout Europe began studying classical philosophy, mathematics, and science. This rediscovery of ancient knowledge, combined with new technologies like printing, fueled the Renaissance and ultimately the scientific revolution. In a very real sense, the fall of the Byzantine Empire accidentally gave Western Europe the intellectual inheritance it needed to eventually surpass the Islamic world in science and technology. Of course, this happened over centuries, and scholars still debate how much the Byzantine refugee scholars contributed versus other factors. But the connection is undeniable. The conquest of Constantinople also motivated European exploration. With the Ottomans controlling the eastern Mediterranean and charging high taxes on trade goods from Asia, European merchants and monarchs sought alternative routes to reach India and China. This directly led to Portuguese exploration of the African coast and Columbus's attempt to reach Asia by sailing west. which instead discovered the Americas. In this way, Mehmed's 1453 victory indirectly set in motion the age of exploration and European colonial expansion. The world map we know today, with European influence spread globally, might never have developed if Constantinople had remained in Christian hands and kept Mediterranean trade routes open. The Ottoman conquest forced Europe to look outward, to innovate, to develop ocean-going ships and navigation techniques that would give them advantages that even the powerful Ottoman Empire couldn't match by sea. Who deserves credit for the fall of Constantinople? Mehmed II certainly earned his epithet, the Conqueror. At just 21 years old, he displayed strategic vision, logistical genius, and determination that would have impressed commanders 3 times his age. His willingness to adopt new technology, Urban's supercannon and other artillery, showed an innovative mindset. His bold decision to haul ships overland to bypass the Golden Horn chain demonstrated creative problem-solving. But we should also recognize the engineers like Urban, who designed the weapons that made victory possible, and the thousands of anonymous Ottoman soldiers who threw themselves at the walls, knowing many would die. On the defensive side, Constantine XI Palaiologos died a hero's death, and his decision to fight alongside his men rather than flee or negotiate surrender has made him a legendary figure in Greek history. Giovanni Giustiniani's leadership was perhaps the only reason the defense lasted 54 days rather than a week. The ordinary Byzantine soldiers and citizens who repaired walls each night, who fought despite impossible odds, who chose death over slavery, they deserve remembrance too. What if Constantinople had held out? What if Western Europe had sent the 20,000 soldiers Constantine XI begged for? What if Giustiniani hadn't been wounded at the critical moment, or if the Cerco Porta gate had been properly locked? If the city had survived, the Byzantine Empire might have recovered. Stranger things have happened in history. But more likely, Mehmed would have returned with an even larger army the next year or the year after. The fundamental reality was that the Ottomans were a rising power with massive resources, while Byzantium was a dying ember clinging to existence through sheer stubbornness. Perhaps the best the defenders could have hoped for was delaying the inevitable by a few years. Yet those few years might have mattered. If Constantinople had held until 1457 or 1460, Mehmed might have been overthrown by rivals. Ottoman politics were brutal, and military failure often meant assassination or forced abdication. A longer siege might have bankrupted the Ottoman treasury and forced them to abandon the conquest attempt. Western Europe might have organized a proper crusade if given more time. We'll never know. But the alternate history scenarios are fascinating to consider. What we do know is that May 29, 1453, marked a turning point in world history as significant as the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD. An empire that traced its lineage back to Constantine the Great in 330 AD, and through him to Augustus Caesar and the founding of Rome itself, finally died. The last political entity with a credible claim to being the Roman Empire ceased to exist. The medieval period, which many historians argue began with Rome's fall, could now be said to have truly ended. The ancient world was completely finished. What followed was the early modern period, an age of gunpowder, global exploration, and rapidly advancing technology. The Renaissance was beginning in Italy. The Reformation would split Christianity within 64 years, and the scientific revolution was barely a century away. Constantinople's fall didn't cause all these changes, but it symbolized them. The old world built by the ancients was finally, irrevocably dead, and a new world was being born. Today, when you visit Istanbul, You can still see the massive Theodosian Walls that held out for 54 days against the world's most powerful army. You can visit the Hagia Sophia, now a mosque again after spending decades as a museum, and imagine Constantine XI praying there one final time before marching to his death. You can stand where the Romanos gate once stood and picture the Janissaries pouring through the breach. And you can see the Bosporus where Mehmed's ships were dragged overland in that incredible logistical feat. The history lives on in the stones and the geography, waiting for visitors who know the story to appreciate what happened there. The conquest of Constantinople reminds us that no matter how invincible something seems, walls that stood 1,000 years, empires that claim divine protection, traditions that stretch back to antiquity, nothing lasts forever. Change comes eventually, often driven by new technologies and determined leaders willing to challenge the impossible. Mehmed II looked at walls that had turned back every previous attacker and decided that this time, with new weapons and new tactics, things would be different. And he was right. Thank you so much for watching this deep dive into one of history's most significant sieges. If you found this fascinating, please hit that like button. Let's see if we can reach 2,000 likes in the next 48 hours. Subscribe to the channel if you want more detailed military history content like this, because we have so many more incredible battles and campaigns to explore. Drop a comment below telling me what historical siege or battle you want me to cover next. Should we go back to ancient times and talk about Alexander's siege of Tyre? Next video, where we continue exploring the battles that shaped our world. Until then, remember that history's greatest lessons come from understanding not just what happened, but why it mattered.